A low, desperate growl echoed from beneath the dusty floorboards of an abandoned warehouse. Down in the darkness, a tiny, shivering puppy stood his ground. He was alone, starving and terrified, but he refused to abandon his post. His mission was to guard the one thing his master had left behind, a locked metal box. The man who found him was Marcus, a former detective who had traded his badge for a carpenter's hammer. He came to this derelict building to silence his past, to build something new over the ruins of a failed career. He thought his job was to fix the broken beams and warped floors. But when he finally earned the trust of the little guardian and lifted the box into the light, he realized his true task had just begun. The box held the key to the very cold case that had destroyed his life. This abandoned puppy wasn't just guarding a secret, he was guarding Marcus's one and only chance at redemption. But I am getting ahead of myself. Let's start from the beginning. The only conversation in the vast, empty warehouse was between the sharp steel of Marcus's plane and the stubborn grain of old pine. Sawdust, smelling of time and forgotten forests, hung in the air, catching the light in golden shafts. For a year, this had been his world, a place of simple, honest work, where the only ghosts were the faded outlines of stacked crates on the floor. He preferred the company of wood. It didn't lie, and it didn't break your heart. Its flaws were on the surface, ready to be smoothed away by patient, steady hands. A distant siren climbed the scale, and the sound cut through the quiet rhythm of his work. His hands stopped. His shoulders tensed into the rigid posture he thought he'd left behind with his badge. For a single, sharp moment, he saw it again. The black and white print of a newspaper headline, the words blurred by memory, but the feeling sharp as glass. Failure. He squeezed his eyes shut, forcing the image away, and deliberately picked up his plane again. The work was the only thing that could sand down the rough edges of his past. From the high, grimy windows, he was just a small, determined shape in a sea of dusty floor. The building was enormous, a skeleton of the city's industrious past, and his project was to bring it back to life, one beam, one board at a time. But the truth was, he wasn't just restoring a building. He was trying to build a wall against the quiet, nagging voice of failure that followed him from his old life. If he could fix this broken place, make it whole and strong again, then maybe, just maybe, he could do the same for himself. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the floor, Marcus ran his hand over the beam he'd been working on all day. It was perfect. The wood was smooth as water, the joints seamless, the grain glowing warmly in the fading light. It was a small thing in a space so large, a single finished sentence on a blank page. But it was solid. It was true. A single line of order in a world of chaos. But as the last echo of his tools faded, the silence that rushed back in felt heavier than before. It felt less like emptiness, and more like it was waiting for something. The next morning, while carrying a heavy load of lumber, his boot caught on something that shouldn't have been there. It wasn't a nail or a splinter. It was a floorboard, right in the middle of a clear path that gave way slightly under his weight. He stopped, balancing the wood on his shoulder. He knew every inch of this floor. This board wasn't rotten or broken. It was loose, as if it had been lifted and replaced, but not by a careful hand. His old instincts, dormant for so long, stirred with a flicker of suspicion. He set the lumber down and knelt, the knees of his jeans immediately covered in fine gray dust. He pressed a hand against the board, and a low, vibrating growl came from the darkness below. It wasn't the sound of a cornered rat. It was deeper, more desperate. He reached for the crowbar on his tool belt, his heart beating a little faster. He didn't rip the board open. He eased it up, the rusty nails groaning in protest as he slowly revealed the dark, cramped space beneath the floor. The beam from his work lamp cut through the darkness, illuminating a scene that made no sense. Huddled in the small, earthy space was a puppy. It was a scruffy bundle of dirty fur and bones, but its eyes were bright with a fierce, desperate courage. It wasn't cowering, it was standing guard. Beneath its paws, protecting it from the damp earth, was a tarnished, old-fashioned metal lockbox. The puppy let out another low growl, a clear warning that was both heartbreaking and absurd, coming from a creature so small and fragile. The old Marcus, the detective, would have seen an obstacle, a complication in retrieving a piece of evidence. But the carpenter, the man he was now, saw something else. A creature more terrified than he had ever been, loyally guarding the only thing it had in the world. He saw a duty being done. Without a word, he slowly, carefully lowered the floorboard back into place, leaving a small gap for air. Then he backed away, giving the darkness its secret back. He stood there in the quiet warehouse, the sound of his own breathing loud in his ears. He now knew he wasn't alone. But he had no idea if he had just found a prisoner, a guardian, or the last living witness to a crime he'd tried so hard to forget. The next morning, Marcus returned with a fresh strategy, a relic of his old profession. He placed a small piece of jerky a few feet from the hole and spoke in the calm, measured tone he once used to de-escalate tense situations. The response from beneath the floor was immediate and clear, a more frantic, high-pitched growl than before. It wasn't a warning anymore, it was a plea to be left alone. He tried again, pushing the food a little closer with a stick. The growling only intensified. His authority, his carefully practiced calm, they were useless here. This wasn't a negotiation. A flicker of his old, impatient anger sparked in his chest, but it died just as quickly. He stopped trying to command the situation and instead just looked, truly looked, at the dark space under the floor. He wasn't seeing a difficult animal. He was seeing pure, cornered terror, and in that desperate defiance, he recognized something of himself. It was the same trapped feeling he saw in his own eyes in the mirror some nights, the feeling of being surrounded by a world you could no longer control or understand. This creature wasn't fighting him, it was fighting for its life. In that moment, he abandoned 2 decades of training. He walked over to a stack of empty wooden crates, chose one, and dragged it across the floor. The scraping sound was loud in the silence. He positioned the crate a good 15 feet from the hole, a distance that felt respectful, and sat down. He didn't speak. He didn't offer any more food. He simply sat, leaned his elbows on his knees, and offered the one thing he had in abundance, his quiet, unassuming presence. He would not be a threat. He would just be there. For what felt like hours, nothing happened. The sun shifted, moving a long rectangle of light across the dusty floor. A truck rumbled by on the street outside. Marcus didn't move. He just sat and breathed, a silent partner in a strange vigil. Then, almost imperceptibly at first, he noticed a change. The low, constant growl from beneath the floor had faded, and then stopped completely. The standoff wasn't over, but the air in the warehouse had changed. A fragile, unspoken truce had been declared. And now, for the first time, Marcus felt like he wasn't waiting for a surrender, but for an invitation. The next day, and the day after that, a new routine took shape. Marcus would arrive, set down his tools, and his first act would be to take up his post on the wooden crate. At noon, he would unwrap his sandwich from its wax paper, the crinkling sound echoing in the cavernous space. He would eat his own lunch first, slowly and deliberately, making no sudden moves. It was a ritual of normalcy, a demonstration of peace in a place that had only known neglect and fear. After he finished his own food, he would break off a piece of bread crust and place it on the floor, about halfway between his crate and the hole. He never tossed it or pushed it. He placed it gently, a simple offering left for the taking. It was not a lure, but an invitation to share a meal, an acknowledgement that another living thing shared this space with him. He was not claiming the territory. He was asking to share it. Then he would begin to speak. His voice was a low, steady murmur, never directed at the hole, but at the warehouse itself. He talked about the warped wood in the rafters, about the price of copper wiring, about a stubborn leak in the roof. He narrated his simple, quiet life, filling the empty air with a calm, human sound that demanded nothing in return. He wasn't trying to coax anything out of the darkness. He was simply making the silence feel less lonely for both of them. One afternoon, his quiet monologue was interrupted. A small, black, wet nose poked out from the gap in the floorboards, twitching, testing the air. It was followed by a pair of wide, intelligent eyes that blinked in the light. The creature saw the bread, considered it for a long moment, and then, with a flicker of movement, vanished back into the safety of the dark. It was a tiny gesture, a fleeting moment, but it was progress. It was a start. A small smile touched Marcus's lips for the first time in days. "You're a stubborn one, aren't you, Rusty?" he whispered to the empty space, giving the small, brave shadow a name. The name made it real, an individual. He was no longer dealing with a problem, but with a personality. That evening, as he packed up his tools, Marcus did something new. He filled a shallow metal bowl with fresh water from a jug and left it near the hole. It was an act of faith, a gift with no strings attached. The next morning when he arrived, the early light slanting through the windows revealed the bowl was completely empty. Day by day, the ritual continued. And day by day, the offering of bread and the bowl of water moved a few inches closer to his crate. He was rebuilding the warehouse with wood and nails, but he was building a bridge to the creature under the floor with patience and bread crusts. The length of that bridge was not measured in feet, but in the slow, fragile, and growing trust. One afternoon, while waiting during his quiet stakeout, Marcus found himself scrolling through his phone, revisiting the ghosts he usually tried to avoid. He pulled up the old news articles about the cold case, the one that had ended his career. He scrolled past the grainy photos of the police tape and the grim-faced officials until one image stopped him. It was a photo of the victim's office, and on the corner of the polished desk sat a distinctive, dark wood box. It wasn't the box itself that caught his eye, but the ornate, custom lock on its front. A jolt went through him, a spark of memory from a long-forgotten evidence log. He remembered the detail clearly now. A custom-made box had been mentioned in the original case file. It had been missing from the scene and was quickly dismissed by the lead detective as a sentimental item of no evidentiary value, likely taken by the family. Marcus's gaze lifted from the bright screen of his phone and fixed on the dark, unassuming hole in the floorboards across from him. The pieces began to click into place with a terrifying, thrilling certainty. The building around him seemed to change. The dust motes dancing in the sunbeams were no longer just dust, they were particles of the past. The silence was no longer empty, it was filled with unspoken history. This wasn't just an abandoned warehouse he was renovating. It was a crime scene, preserved under a thick layer of time and neglect. And he, the disgraced detective, was standing right in the middle of it again, years later, by a strange and impossible twist of fate. His reason for being here, for sitting on this crate day after day, had shifted. This was no longer just about his own peace of mind or about saving a frightened animal. It was about duty. A duty to the man in the photograph who never got justice, and a new, unexpected duty to the tiny, loyal guardian who had refused to abandon his post. He had to know what was in that box. He had to finish the job. He had failed all those years ago. He was so lost in thought, so deep in the past, that he didn't notice the movement at first. But a soft, scratching sound pulled him back to the present. Rusty was fully out of the hole. He was no longer peeking. He stood in the open, cautiously but deliberately eating the piece of bread Marcus had left for him. He was a real, solid creature, no longer just a shadow in the dark. Marcus held his breath, not daring to move a muscle. He felt like a man watching a rare bird finally land on his windowsill. Rusty finished the last crumb, licked his lips, and then did something unexpected. He looked directly at Marcus. It wasn't a look of fear or aggression. It was a calm, steady gaze, a quiet assessment. Then, with a slow turn, he retreated back to the safety of his den. As the puppy disappeared back into the darkness, Marcus understood. Rusty wasn't guarding a thing, he was guarding a story. The lockbox wasn't just a container of forgotten items. It was a final message, a last will and testament entrusted to the most loyal keeper imaginable. And now, the heavy, silent question hung in the air. What secret was so important that it had to be protected by a guardian who could never, ever speak? An unseasonably cold autumn storm rolled in off the coast, turning the sky a bruised purple. A fierce wind rattled the warehouse's metal roof, and a chilling dampness seeped through the old walls, making the cavernous space feel more like a cave than a building. Marcus shivered, zipping up his jacket, and then he heard it, a faint, rhythmic whimpering from under the floorboards. It was a sound of pure misery, the cry of a small creature losing its battle against the cold. Without a second thought, he unzipped his own thick, flannel-lined work coat. It was heavy and smelled of sawdust and sweat, but it was warm. He folded it into a makeshift bed and laid it on the floor a few feet from the hole, a silent offering of warmth and comfort against the encroaching cold. He then retreated to his crate and waited, his own discomfort forgotten. Rusty's small, dark head peeked out from the gap. He was visibly shivering, his whole body trembling. He looked at the jacket, a mountain of warmth so close, then looked over at Marcus, his eyes wide with a conflict of need versus fear. The instinct to survive was warring with the instinct to hide. For a long, tense moment, the puppy remained frozen on the edge of his dark sanctuary, caught in a painful indecision. Finally, the cold won. With a visible effort of will, Rusty crawled slowly out of the hole and onto the very edge of the jacket. He didn't burrow into it. He just curled into a tight, shivering ball on the flannel, as if he were still trying to take up as little space as possible. It was a brave advance into enemy territory, driven by a desperate need he could no longer ignore. Seeing the puppy's courage, Marcus made a move of his own. He slid off his crate and lay down on the dusty concrete floor, propping himself up on one elbow. He made himself smaller, less intimidating, putting himself on the puppy's level. He didn't try to get closer. He just closed the vertical distance between them, a gesture of peace, a signal that he was no threat. Slowly, tentatively, Rusty began to move. He uncurled his small body and crawled, inch by painful inch, across the soft expanse of the jacket until he was pressed up against Marcus's side. He wasn't asking for affection. He was simply seeking the radiant heat of another living body. Marcus could feel the tiny, rapid thump of the puppy's heart against his ribs, a frantic, living rhythm in the cold, quiet warehouse. Marcus waited until the shivering began to subside, until the small body against his had relaxed just a fraction. Then, moving with excruciating slowness, he raised his hand and gently, so gently, rested it on the puppy's small back. Rusty flinched, a tremor of fear running through him, but he didn't pull away. He leaned into the touch, a silent surrender. In the heart of the storm, under the rumbling roof, a bridge of trust, built with patience and warmth, had finally been crossed. In the days that followed the storm, everything was different. The space under the floorboards was now an empty den. Rusty no longer hid. He was Marcus's constant, silent shadow, his little legs trotting to keep up as Marcus moved around the warehouse, measuring boards and climbing ladders. A new, unspoken partnership had formed, the two of them moving through their shared space with a comfortable, quiet understanding. When Marcus was working, his hands busy with tools, Rusty would claim the old flannel jacket as his own designated spot. He would curl up and sleep, but it was never a deep sleep. One eye would always be open, and his ears would twitch at every sound, and his gaze would frequently drift back to the dark, open hole in the floor. His duty as a guardian had not been forgotten, even if he had a new companion. One afternoon, Marcus put down his hammer and walked over to the hole. He knelt, the dust puffing up around his knees. This time, there was no growl, no fear. Rusty, who had been dozing on the jacket, got up and padded over to sit beside the opening. He looked up at Marcus, his head cocked, his expression one of calm, patient expectation. It was as if he had been waiting for this moment. Marcus looked from the puppy's intelligent eyes to the dark space under the floor, then back again. It was a silent question, an ask for permission. He slowly, deliberately, reached his hand toward the dark opening, his eyes never leaving the puppy's face, watching for any sign of distress, ready to pull back at the slightest hesitation. Rusty remained perfectly still. As Marcus's hand hovered over the hole, the puppy leaned forward and gave the back of his hand a soft, deliberate nudge with his cold, wet nose. It was a clear, unmistakable signal of consent. It was permission, granted. With the puppy's silent blessing, Marcus reached into the darkness. His fingers brushed against the damp earth and then the cold, rough texture of metal. He grasped the handle of the lockbox and carefully, reverently, lifted it out of its hiding place and into the light for the first time in years. He placed the box on the floor between them, a solid, heavy piece of the past now resting in the present. His job was done. Rusty seemed to understand this. The little dog let out a soft sigh, lay down on the floor, and rested his head on his paws, watching Marcus with tired but trusting eyes. His long, lonely watch was finally, truly over. Marcus ran his thumb over the lockbox, the metal cool against his skin. Dust and dried earth clung to its intricate engravings. He recognized the strange, custom-made lock immediately. It was an exact match to the one in the crime scene photograph on his phone. It was real. After all these years of doubt and second-guessing, here was a solid, tangible piece of the puzzle he had thought was lost forever. He didn't try to force it open. That felt wrong, like a violation of the trust he had just been given. Instead, he went to his toolbox and returned with a set of delicate, precision tools, the kind used for fine woodworking, not for breaking and entering. He knelt on the floor, with Rusty watching intently beside him, and began to work on the lock. It wasn't an act of force. It was a conversation with the mechanism, a patient, respectful process of understanding how it worked. After several minutes of careful probing and gentle pressure, there was a soft, satisfying click. The sound was small, but it echoed in the vast, silent warehouse like a closing chapter. The lock had given way. Marcus paused, his hand resting on the lid, taking a deep breath. He felt the weight of years of unanswered questions, of a life derailed by this very secret. Then he lifted the lid. The contents were not what he had expected. There was no weapon, no ledger filled with illicit dealings, no confession. The first thing he saw was a stack of letters tied neatly with a faded silk ribbon. And beside them, carefully folded, was a single photograph. He felt a pang of disappointment. This wasn't the clear-cut evidence he had imagined. He carefully unfolded the photograph first. It wasn't a picture of a criminal or a victim. It was a picture of a father. The man from the case files, the man the police had painted as a dangerous figure, was smiling, a genuine, unguarded smile of pure joy. In his arms, he was holding a young girl with bright, laughing eyes. They were on a beach, the sun in their hair, the picture of a happy, normal family. With a growing sense of urgency, he untied the ribbon and began to read the letters. They were all addressed to the daughter in the photograph. They were not confessions of guilt, but chronicles of fear. The man wrote about a business partner who was becoming more dangerous, about threats, about his attempts to untangle himself from a situation that was spiraling out of his control. He was creating a record, a trail of truth for his daughter to find one day. Marcus sat back on his heels, the letters resting in his lap. The entire case, the foundation of his failure, had been a lie. It wasn't a story of a deal gone wrong between two criminals. It was the story of a father desperately trying to protect his child, a hero who had been wrongly painted as a villain. And the truth had been here all along, guarded by the most innocent and loyal soul he had ever known. Marcus sat on the floor of the quiet warehouse, the letters spread out before him like a hand of cards. He held the power to reclaim his life. One call to the right reporter, and the story would explode. He would be the hero, the tenacious detective vindicated after years of disgrace. The thought was tempting, a sweet balm for a wound that had never properly healed. He could have his name back. He could have his old life back. But as he looked at the smiling family in the photograph, he wondered what that public spectacle would cost them. His gaze drifted to Rusty, who was sleeping soundly at his feet, his side rising and falling in a steady, peaceful rhythm. The puppy hadn't guarded that box for fame or revenge. His loyalty was a simple, absolute thing, a force of nature like gravity. It wasn't transactional, it was pure. Rusty had done the right thing simply because it was the right thing to do. In the quiet logic of the dog's devotion, Marcus saw a better path forward, a quieter kind of justice. He spent the next hour at a small copy shop in town, the bright fluorescent lights feeling harsh and alien after the soft light of his warehouse. He carefully duplicated every letter and the single photograph, the machine humming as it copied the secrets of the past. He chose a different kind of justice, not the loud, chaotic justice of the courts and the media, but the quiet, personal justice the victim had originally intended for his daughter. Peace, not glory. He placed the crisp copies into a large, plain manila envelope. On the front, he wrote the name and address of the victim's daughter, now a grown woman living a quiet life in the suburbs, according to a quick search. There was no return address. The package would be a ghost, a voice from the past delivering a long overdue truth without revealing its source. That night, under a starless sky, he drove his old truck through sleeping suburban streets. He found the right house, a modest home with a light on in the living room window. He didn't linger. He simply slid the thick envelope into the mailbox, the metal flap closing with a soft, final click. As he drove away, he felt a weight he hadn't even realized he was carrying lift from his shoulders. It was done. Back in the warehouse, he looked at the original letters, now resting safely on his workbench. He felt a profound and settled peace, the kind that comes from a difficult job finally completed. He had honored the father's last wish and Rusty's long vigil. He could finally close the door on that part of his life. He smiled at the sleeping dog, believing with all his heart that the story was finally, truly over. Miles away, in a glass-walled office overlooking the city lights, a phone rang, breaking the late-night silence. A powerful man answered it. He listened for a long moment, his expression hardening from annoyance to cold, sharp alarm. The ghost he had buried years ago had just reappeared, and someone had given it a voice. A week later, the warehouse was no longer a place of secrets and shadows. It was a place of light. Sun streamed through the newly cleaned windows, illuminating a space that was beginning to feel like a home. Marcus was on the floor, tossing a wadded-up ball of paper for Rusty, who bounded after it with clumsy, joyous enthusiasm. The sound of the dog's happy scrambling and Marcus's quiet laughter filled the air. For the first time in years, Marcus felt a simple, uncomplicated happiness. The joyful sound was cut short by a figure standing in the massive open doorway. A man in a perfectly tailored suit stood silhouetted against the bright afternoon, a dark shape that didn't belong in Marcus's world of sawdust and sunlight. Marcus's smile faded. He recognized him instantly. It was Detective Sullivan, the man who had been the lead investigator on the cold case, the man who had cemented Marcus's fall from grace. Sullivan walked in, his expensive shoes crunching softly on the dusty floor. He smiled a politician's smile, wide and empty. "Marcus, heard you were fixing this old place up." "Looks good," he said, his eyes scanning the space, taking in every detail. "Just happened to be in the neighborhood, thought I'd stop by and say hello." The excuse was so thin it was transparent. Sullivan was never just in the neighborhood. He walked closer, his gaze lingering on the rafters. "Funny thing," he said, his tone casual, almost conversational. "You hear about the family in that old waterfront case? The daughter. Apparently, she got some old papers in the mail. Some kind of closure, I guess." He glanced sideways at Marcus, his eyes sharp and probing, searching for any flicker of recognition, any sign of guilt. Sullivan stopped directly in front of Marcus, close enough that Marcus could smell his expensive cologne. He leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a low, confidential murmur that was more menacing than any shout. "You know, some things, they're better left buried, Marcus, for everyone's sake." It wasn't advice. It was an order, wrapped in the thin veneer of a friendly warning. Just then, Rusty, who had been watching silently from a few feet away, moved. He didn't bark. He didn't charge. He simply walked forward and stood directly between Marcus and the detective, planting his small feet firmly on the ground. A low, guttural growl rumbled in his chest. Sullivan looked down at the small, defiant dog, his friendly mask slipping for a second to reveal a flash of pure, cold disdain. Without another word, Sullivan straightened his suit jacket, gave Marcus one last, hard look, and walked out. He disappeared as quickly as he had arrived, leaving a thick, uneasy silence in his wake. The sunlight streaming through the windows suddenly felt cold. Marcus looked down at the little dog still standing guard at his feet, and he knew his old life hadn't just knocked on the door, it had kicked it wide open. In the days following Sullivan's visit, the comfortable solitude of the warehouse curdled into a tense, watchful quiet. Marcus couldn't shake the feeling of being observed. He'd be working on a high beam and would feel a prickle on the back of his neck, a sudden, certain conviction that a pair of eyes was on him from the street below. He'd look, but there was never anyone there. The feeling, however, remained, a constant, low-level hum of anxiety. The messages became more direct. He went out for less than an hour to buy more lumber, carefully locking the heavy sliding door behind him. When he returned, everything was exactly as he'd left it, except for a single wood chisel. He knew, with absolute certainty, that he had left it on his workbench. It was now sitting in the middle of the floor, perfectly aligned with the door, a silent statement. I was here. I can come and go as I please. The nights were the worst. The warehouse, once his sanctuary, now felt vast and full of threatening shadows. One night, he was startled awake by Rusty, who was standing rigid by the cot, barking with a ferocity Marcus had never heard before. The barks weren't aimed at the door, but upward, at one of the high, dark windows near the roof. Marcus grabbed a heavy flashlight, his heart pounding, and swept the beam across the glass. He saw nothing but his own pale, startled reflection. But Rusty continued to whine, his nose pointed at the window, convinced of a presence Marcus couldn't see. The next morning, driven by a gnawing suspicion, Marcus did a slow, methodical search of the warehouse's perimeter. And there, near a seldom-used side door half hidden by overgrown weeds, he found it. In a patch of thick dust that the rain hadn't washed away was a single, partial footprint. It was from a smooth-soled, expensive-looking shoe, not the deep-treaded print of his own work boots. It was the final, undeniable proof. That afternoon, the carpenter took a back seat to the detective. Marcus spent hours securing his fortress. He hammered heavy boards over the lower windows, wedged steel bars into the tracks of the sliding doors, and changed the padlock on the main entrance. He was no longer just renovating a building, he was fortifying a position against an unseen enemy. His workshop had become a barricade. That night, sleep was not an option. Marcus sat in a wooden chair in the darkest corner of the warehouse, a heavy wrench resting on his lap. He watched the doors, his senses on high alert. At his feet, Rusty lay awake, his head on his paws, his ears twitching at every creak of the old building, at every gust of wind. They were a two-man watch, sharing the long, dark hours, both knowing that the threat was no longer a possibility. It was real. It was close, and it was hunting them. The attack, when it came, wasn't against the barricaded doors. It arrived in broad daylight, driving a clean white van with the official city seal emblazoned on its side. A man in a crisp uniform stepped out, a clipboard in his hand and a look of detached professionalism on his face. He was from the City Animal Control Department. Marcus felt a cold knot of dread form in his stomach. This was a move he hadn't anticipated. The officer explained the situation in a polite, bureaucratic monotone. An anonymous complaint had been filed. A concerned citizen reported a stray dog living in what was classified as an active, and therefore unsafe, construction zone. The complaint also mentioned unsanitary living conditions. The words were clinical and impersonal, but to Marcus, they felt like a direct, personal assault. Sullivan was clever. He wasn't using fists. He was using forms and regulations. The officer walked through the warehouse, making notes on his clipboard. He pointed out the obvious, the exposed wiring, the stacks of heavy materials, the lack of a proper fenced-in area. Everything he said was true. Marcus's sanctuary, his home, was being reframed by the cold language of city ordinances as a hazardous environment. His efforts to build a safe life for himself and Rusty were being twisted into proof of his negligence. Marcus looked at the officer, then at Rusty, who was sitting by the cot, wagging his tail, oblivious. A wave of sickening clarity washed over him. This wasn't about intimidation anymore. This was a calculated act of cruelty. Sullivan wasn't trying to hurt him physically, he was targeting his heart. He was systematically dismantling the one good thing Marcus had built in his new life, using the very laws Marcus had once sworn to uphold. The officer handed him a printed notice. The language was formal, but the message was a brutal ultimatum. Marcus had 72 hours. He had to provide legal proof of ownership, vet records, a license, and demonstrate that he had a safe and suitable home for the animal. If he couldn't, Rusty would be impounded. The word hung in the air, cold and final. Marcus tried to argue, to explain the unique circumstances, but his words sounded weak and desperate against the unassailable logic of the officer's position. To the man in the uniform, he wasn't a retired detective in hiding. He was just another guy with a stray dog in a place that wasn't zoned for residential living. The rules were the rules. There was no room for nuance. The officer left, his van kicking up a small cloud of dust as it pulled away. Marcus stood in the middle of the warehouse, the warning notice clutched in his hand. The silence that followed was heavier than ever before. He looked at Rusty, who trotted over and nudged his hand, looking for a friendly pat. A 72-hour clock had just started ticking, and for the first time in a long time, Marcus had absolutely no idea what to do next. For a long hour, Marcus just sat on the floor, the official notice, a flimsy, damning piece of paper in his hand. He felt the same crushing powerlessness he'd felt the day he'd turned in his badge. He had built these thick walls and bolted these heavy doors to keep the world out, and now that same world was threatening to reach in and take the only thing that mattered. He was trapped inside his own fortress, his own choices now working against him. Then he felt a gentle pressure on his knee. Rusty had come over and rested his head there, looking up at him with those deep brown eyes. There was no fear in them, no confusion. There was only a simple, absolute trust. It was the look of a loyal soldier waiting for his commander's next order. It was a silent, powerful reminder of who he was fighting for. In that quiet moment, something inside Marcus shifted. The despair that had been choking him solidified into a cold, hard resolve. The carpenter who fixed broken things was gone. The ex-cop who hid from his past was gone. The detective was back. He would not lose this fight. He would not let Sullivan win. He would not fail this small, trusting creature who had asked for nothing and given him everything. He stood up, his movements now precise and purposeful. He walked to a far corner of the warehouse, to an old green army footlocker he'd dragged with him from one lonely apartment to another. He wiped a thick layer of dust from the lid with the heel of his hand and unlatched it. The hinges groaned in protest as he opened it, releasing the faint, musty smell of old paper and stale memories. The contents were not Carpenter's tools. They were the artifacts of his former life, a ghost kit he hadn't touched in years. There were spiral-bound notebooks filled with his precise, block-lettered handwriting, a microcassette recorder, a worn leather-bound book filled with the names and numbers of old contacts, snitches, beat cops, clerks. It was a life he had tried to bury, but one he now desperately needed. He pulled out a fresh notebook and a pen that still worked. He was no longer just a man trying to protect his dog. He was an investigator, building a case. He would not just defend against Sullivan's attacks. He would go on the offensive. He would uncover whatever secret Sullivan was so desperate to keep buried, and he would use it to save them both. He flipped through the old address book until he found the name he was looking for. He pulled out his cell phone, his fingers dialing the number from memory. The phone rang 3 times before a woman's voice answered, cautious and wary. "Agnes," Marcus said, his own voice steady and clear, stripped of all its recent fear. "It's Marcus. I need a favor. It's about the old waterfront case." Over the phone, Agnes, the retired police records clerk, was hesitant. Her voice was tinged with the weary caution of someone who had spent 30 years watching good people get chewed up by the system. "Marcus, I'm out," she said, her voice raspy. "I spend my days gardening now. I left all that noise behind for a reason." She remembered Marcus, and she remembered the case that had broken him. She didn't want to get pulled back into that darkness. Marcus didn't try to appeal to her sense of justice or loyalty to the force. He knew those wells had run dry long ago. Instead, he told her the simple truth. He told her about a quiet warehouse, a scared puppy under the floorboards, and the animal control officer's 72-hour ultimatum. He didn't talk about his career or about revenge. He talked about Rusty, the simple, honest story of a man trying to save his dog, cut through years of cynicism. "All right, Marcus," Agnes sighed. "What are you looking for?" The following afternoon, in a vast, dimly lit city archive that smelled of aging paper and dust, Agnes was at work. She moved through the towering metal shelves with the quiet confidence of a librarian in her natural habitat. She wasn't looking in the official case file. She knew Sullivan would have scrubbed that clean years ago. She was hunting for a ghost, a piece of paper that had been misplaced, misfiled, and forgotten. And she found it, tucked away in a box of miscellaneous incident reports from the wrong year, was a single, flimsy carbon copy. Her eyes, accustomed to scanning faded ink, moved quickly down the page. It was a supplementary report filed by a rookie patrolman, one of the first officers on the scene of the waterfront crime. Her breath caught in her throat as she read the officer's transcribed witness statement. The report detailed an interview with the victim's next-door neighbor, an elderly man who'd been sitting on his porch that night. The neighbor claimed to have seen a car, not the victim's, leaving the warehouse at high speed shortly after he heard a loud argument. He even gave a partial license plate number. At the bottom of the page, in a different, more decisive handwriting, was a short, handwritten note from the lead investigator, Sullivan. It read, "Witness elderly, confused, unreliable, do not pursue." Agnes immediately found a quiet corner and called Marcus, her voice a hushed, urgent whisper. "You were right, Marcus." "Oh, you were so right," she said, the excitement palpable even over the phone. He didn't just miss a lead. He didn't just overlook something. He saw the truth, and he buried it. Intentionally. Marcus hung up the phone, the world seeming to slow down around him. He looked at the notes he had scrawled in his own notebook, the timeline, the connections he had been piecing together. Agnes's discovery was the keystone. With that one piece of buried evidence, the entire corrupt structure of the original investigation didn't just look weak, it fell apart completely. He now knew what Sullivan was protecting, and he knew it was a secret worth killing for. Marcus had to get the copy of that report. Agnes, wary of technology and traceable data, refused to send it electronically. They had to meet. He filled Rusty's bowls with extra food and fresh water, then did one last check of the newly reinforced side door. He hated leaving the dog alone, the warehouse now feeling less like a fortress and more like a baited trap. "Be a good boy," he murmured, giving Rusty a final scratch behind the ears before sliding the heavy door shut, the sound echoing his own unease. Not 10 minutes after Marcus's truck had disappeared down the street, A key slid silently into the new padlock. It was a professional's tool, a bump key, and it opened the lock with a quiet, oily click. Sullivan slipped inside, moving with a fluid grace that belied his size. He didn't waste time. He went straight for the area around Marcus's cot, his eyes scanning for the telltale shape of a metal box. He was so focused, so intent on his search, that he didn't hear the soft padding of paws on the concrete behind him. A low, rumbling growl echoed from the shadows near the workbench. Sullivan froze, his hand hovering over a wooden crate. He turned slowly, a flicker of annoyance on his face. He'd expected a yapping, nervous puppy, not this. Rusty wasn't barking. He wasn't charging. He was simply standing there, his small body lowered into a solid, unmoving stance, a silent, furry guardian planted firmly between the intruder and the corner, where the real lockbox was hidden beneath a pile of canvas tarps. The standoff was absolute. Sullivan was a man who operated through intimidation and veiled threats, his power derived from his badge and his connections. He was a bully, not a brawler. Faced with this small creature's pure, uncomplicated defiance, he was unnerved. He took a half step forward, and the growl deepened, vibrating through the quiet air. He glanced at his watch. His window of time was closing. With a quiet curse, he made his decision. He backed away slowly, slipped out of the warehouse, and locked the door behind him, leaving no trace of his presence. When Marcus returned, the copy of the report a folded secret in his jacket pocket, he knew something was wrong. The moment he stepped inside, the air was different, charged with a lingering tension. Rusty was pacing back and forth by the door, whining softly, his body language a clear signal of distress. Then Marcus smelled it, the faint, cloying scent of Sullivan's expensive cologne. He saw the almost invisible scuff marks on the floor near his cot. Someone had been here. He knelt down and Rusty immediately pressed against him, trembling slightly. Marcus wrapped his arms around the small, warm body, a wave of profound gratitude washing over him. He understood what had happened. This little dog, once so terrified of the world that he had to hide from it, had stood his ground against the source of all their fear. He hadn't just been guarding a box of old letters. He had been guarding their home. He had been guarding their future. The next morning, Marcus made a call. He chose the meeting place, the end of a windswept fishing pier at dawn. It was open, public ground, with the gray, choppy water of the bay on three sides. There would be no corners to get trapped in, no shadows for an ambush. It was a place for things to be brought out into the open. Sullivan arrived just as the sun was breaking through the morning fog, looking perfectly composed in his tailored overcoat. He had a smug, confident air, the look of a man who believed he held all the cards. He clearly assumed Marcus had called this meeting to negotiate a surrender, to beg him to call off the animal control threat. He was here to watch Marcus break. Marcus didn't waste time with greetings. He waited until Sullivan was standing in front of him. Then he pulled the folded copy of the buried report from his pocket and slid it across the weathered wooden bench that separated them. The witness was Robert Miller, Marcus said, his voice quiet but carrying clearly in the sea air. The victim's neighbor. He gave a partial plate. You told the reporting officer he was confused and to drop it. The smug look on Sullivan's face vanished, replaced by a flash of disbelief, then a flicker of panic. He quickly regained his composure, cycling through a series of bluffs and threats. He talked about Marcus's tarnished record, about how no one would believe a disgraced cop. He talked about his connections, his power. He even offered Marcus a cut, a way for them both to walk away from this clean. But the man he was talking to was not the same broken man he had visited in the warehouse. Marcus was unmoved. The threats felt hollow, the offers of money insulting. He had spent the last year building a life that wasn't measured by reputation or bank accounts. He had something Sullivan couldn't touch, and that gave him a strength Sullivan couldn't comprehend. Seeing that his usual tactics were failing, Sullivan's voice took on a harder edge. But before he could issue his next threat, Marcus delivered the final blow. The original report has been scanned and sent to a secure third-party server, he said, his voice flat and calm. And I took the liberty of tracing the anonymous complaint to Animal Control. It came from a burner phone, one you bought for cash at a convenience store 2 blocks from your office last week. It's over, Sullivan. Sullivan stared at Marcus, his mouth slightly open. He was looking for the fear, the anger, the desperation he was so used to seeing in the eyes of his victims. But there was none. There was only a quiet, unshakable certainty. In the cold light of dawn, surrounded by the vast emptiness of the sky and sea, the powerful detective was finally, utterly trapped. Back in the warehouse, the folded report sat on the workbench, a small piece of paper holding the power to detonate a man's life. Marcus held it in his hand, feeling its weight. The temptation was a bitter, satisfying taste in his mouth. He could go to the press. He could watch Sullivan's face plastered across the news, watch the career he had built on lies crumble to dust. He could have his public revenge. He deserved it. But then his eyes fell on the simple, honest tools of his new life. The hand plane with its polished wooden handle, the sharp chisels lined up in a neat row, the sleeping dog curled on his jacket. This was his world now. It was a world of building, of creating, of making things whole. Tearing Sullivan's life down felt like an act that belonged to his past, a destructive impulse that had no place in the quiet, constructive peace he had fought so hard to find. He made a decision. He took the report, along with a short, typed letter explaining its context, and sealed it in a fresh envelope. But he didn't address it to a newspaper or a television station. He addressed it to a captain in the Internal Affairs Division, a woman he had known years ago, one of the few people from his old life he knew to have an unshakable moral compass. He walked to a public mailbox on a busy street corner and posted the letter. As it slid through the slot and disappeared, he felt a final, definitive release. He wasn't just handing off the evidence. He was letting go of the outcome. He was surrendering his need to control the narrative, to see the punishment delivered. He was trusting that the truth, once set in motion, would find its own way. He turned and walked away without looking back. The next day, his phone rang. It was the Animal Control Department. A polite, slightly confused clerk informed him that the complaint against him had been formally withdrawn by an anonymous source. The 72-hour clock was no longer ticking. The shadow that had been hanging over them had lifted as quietly as it had appeared. There were no dramatic headlines in the following weeks, no televised press conferences. Just a short, bland article buried on page 6 of the city paper announcing Detective Sullivan's unexpected early retirement due to personal health reasons. Marcus read it, folded the paper, and felt a quiet sense of rightness. The scales had been balanced, not with a crash, but with a quiet, steady click. As he stood in the doorway of his warehouse, the afternoon sun warming his face, Marcus felt a new kind of freedom. It wasn't just freedom from a false accusation or from a dangerous enemy. It was a deeper freedom, the freedom from the corrosive anger and the thirst for revenge that had been his constant companions for so long. He was finally, truly, at peace. Marcus lifted the last large pane of glass into the final empty window frame. It was heavy and awkward, but his movements were sure and steady. He carefully secured it in place, tapping the final glazing points into the soft wood. As the last one went in, a brilliant beam of late afternoon sunlight, unobstructed for the first time, lanced across the entire length of the warehouse, chasing the last of the stubborn shadows from the farthest corners. The building was transformed. It was no longer a derelict shell, a tomb for old memories. It was a workshop, a studio, a home. The air, once thick with the ghosts of industry, now smelled of fresh-cut cedar, linseed oil, and brewing coffee. Soft music played from a small radio on a workbench, its gentle melody weaving through the warm, sunlit space. It was a place of life, a place of creation. Marcus sat on the newly built wooden steps that led up to his small living quarters in the loft, a simple sandwich in his hands. He took a bite, then tore off a piece of the crust and held it down. Rusty, who was sitting proudly beside him, took it with a gentle, practiced softness. The frantic, starving creature from under the floor was gone, replaced by a confident, healthy companion whose brown coat shone in the new light. On the newly built mantelpiece above a small wood-burning stove, the old lockbox sat in a place of honor. It wasn't hidden away or locked up. It was displayed openly, its tarnished metal glowing in the sunlight. It was no longer a container of dark secrets, but a monument, a constant, quiet reminder that the strongest foundations are built not with wood and nails, but with courage and trust. On his main workbench, a fresh set of blueprints was unrolled, held down at the corners by smooth river stones. It was a detailed plan for a set of custom library shelves, a new commission from a client in town who had heard of the quiet, meticulous carpenter working out of the old waterfront warehouse. It was his first job as a truly free man, a project defined not by his past, but by his future. As Marcus studied the plans, making a small note in the margins with a pencil, Rusty padded over to a warm patch of sunlight on the floor. He turned in a circle 3 times before curling up, letting out a long, soft sigh of perfect, absolute contentment. His work was done. His man was safe. His world was warm and quiet. Marcus paused his work, a small smile on his face. He reached down and rested his hand on Rusty's back, feeling the slow, steady rhythm of his breathing. The man and his dog, 2 solitary souls who had found each other in the darkness, were finally at peace. They were home. This is the end of the story. Thank you for listening. If you liked the story, please consider liking and subscribing to my humble channel. And if you propose an idea for the next story that you want to hear in comments, I just may do it. Goodbye.